What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Final Assembly Part 2, but without further ado, let's check it out. So we're going to start this video off showing you how we installed, or at least TJ installed, the window in the front bodywork of my store WF1. Now there's a big reason we're doing this. It's not because we want to look out the front of the car. It's because we need a clear path for the GPS beacons for both the Flagtronics and my Smarty Cam to see daylight. Now, carbon fiber is a highly conductive material, which basically means it acts as what they call a Faraday cage, which effectively blocks radio frequency signals like those you use in your GPS systems. One of the other jobs TJ got sorted for us is installing a final hardpoint. Now, hardpoints are basically solid blocks that are going to be in the floor, and, well, it's going to allow us to better reinforce the floor and support it, especially on the outer edges of the car. There was one that came included in my car, or at least in the left side tunnel, but for whatever reason, we just need to add one in a different location for the right side. Now, we also got all of the frames finally bonded together. We also decided not to bond the tunnels into the radiator supports, at least at this stage, mainly because we wanted to make sure everything fit brilliantly. Circling back to the hard points in the floor, these stay cables are what we were talking about in terms of what we're going to be putting into those hard points. Now, the one we installed is on the right side, and I'm just resetting all the rods for both the left and the right hand side just to make sure they're perfect. Now you can see I'm drilling and installing the fastener on my floor to hold the stay cable to it that's going through the brand new block that we put into the floor panel itself. And for that insert, we were using Garolite, which was recommended to me by the manufacturer's restore itself. Now obviously, also had to do the stay rods for the front and get those final adjustments in place before putting the car together 100% for the final time. So once we got done with the stay cables, we could move on to finally finishing installing the ductwork for my radiator and my oil cooler. Now this, obviously, as we mentioned before, required a decent amount of trimming, and we did little bit by little bit until we were really happy with how it fit in the side pod. Now with carbon fiber work, you always get dust, you're always going to get splinters, but at the end of the day, we ended up with a spectacular fitting radiator and oil cooler duct. Now, one of the surprising things for me is, well, we ended up pinning them together, and when we pinned them together, we were able to remove them as one unit. We didn't need to disassemble anything. So one thing we had to do is we had to trim the nose off. As you can see, we had extra material to stick out the front of the radiator duct, but that was only there just to make sure we didn't shortcut it originally when we were making the parts. We always knew we were going to make this trim because we needed the actual ductwork to sit in behind the leading edge of the side pod. That's to make sure that it's obviously not sticking out the front of the car, but more importantly, making sure that both the center section and the front fenders fit properly with the bodywork. That, and if you actually take a close look, there's recesses inside the ductwork where we could actually increase the total opening size of the radiator ducts to hide behind the leading edges of the carbon work for both the center section and the side pod. After I got done with the radiator, I could get started on the oil cooler side. Now this one's a little bit easier because I don't have what we'll call the old P2 bump shifter in the side, so there's a little bit more room for me to move this side pod around. Now obviously the trimming is exactly the same. Got to cut and make sure that the heights all work. Then we got to make sure that the leading edge doesn't stick out too far, but just sticks out enough. Now one of the other things you'll notice when I put on the center section, it's not actually a square box. There's a low point on the outside, and it gets to be taller inwards towards the bodywork. So now we're done installing the radiators and the oil coolers. We can go ahead and get the engine in, and that will allow me to start laying the groundwork for installing the actual cooling system. Now, we've got the radiator set in, we've got to set in the engine, but we've got to plumb the radiator tubes going to and from my motor. Not only that, we've got to lay the groundwork, or at least get a roadmap for what we need in terms of the swirl pot. Now, some people know, some people don't, but the swirl pot is basically the high point for a cooling system. If we didn't put this in, we wouldn't be able to really have the radiator cap at the highest point in the system. Right here though, I'm just installing the turns to go both out of the motor and into the motor, and where we're going to run the water pump. The water pump is that little black thing right there, and you can see that hose right there that goes up and in is where the water will flow into the motor. The upper hose is where it's going to come out. And you can see this is hose one of how we're going to do the swirl pot. The swirl pot's just mounted right there behind my head against the firewall. Now you can see we've got a 90-degree angle and it's getting fed around the engine. And then we're also going to work on, well, we're going to install a temporary mount to try out the dry sump. Mainly because, well, we've got to try to get both the oil lines feeding and returning from the engine and making sure there's room for everything. Now this is an ongoing process. We just have gotten to the point where we have come up with the idea as to what we need to do with this dry sump tank. But the good news is we think we're going to be able to run it without heavily altering it. Now I am in a little bit of a time crunch right now, trying to get the car onto the dyno with Dave Ferguson at Verocity Racing Data. So we decided not to modify the dry sump tank until after we're done successfully dynoing the car. So we finally got springs for the TTXs, so we're going to go ahead and install those at this time and start getting them mounted in the car for good. Now we're running 1,300 pound springs in the front and 1,550 pound springs in the rear. So that's going to be, well, let's be real, that's a lot of spring pressure. But with the amount of downforce we get, we're still going to be putting parts of my car on the ground, even with these high spring rates. Now, one of the other things that I've kind of omitted, but we need to start really having a firm mounting place for, is the ECU and the PDU. That's what I'm working on right here. Is there's this little plate that's going to go behind my head. Not only is it going to hold in place what we'll call my halo or rodeo collar, but it's also going to house the ECU, the PDU, the pneumatic blipper, and the start solenoid. So right now I'm going and getting started on mounting them into the frame of my car. From there, I've got to be able to put the ECU on the bottom. Then we're also going to put the PDU on a tray that goes and squeezes the ECU in place. You can see I've got a start solenoid just right there above my hand. That's the factory Suzuki start solenoid for the Suzuki Hayabusa. Now I'm just trying to run all the wires to their respective locations because, well, putting the lift tube in place kind of made it a little bit of a pain in the butt to get all of this stuff fit in there. But at the end of the day, it ended up fitting in pretty well. So that's it for this second video, highlighting what we've done. We're obviously a little bit further along than my editing, but we'll show you that in episode 3. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video.